Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for everyone who's joining us live for today's Lunch and Learn, Communicating Care in Coastal Fisheries, Narratives of Restoration, Adaptation, and Collaborative Policy Change. And thank you to everyone who's watching the recording. We are so delighted to welcome Professor Bridie McGreevy, Associate Professor of Environmental Communications at the University of Maine. I've had the privilege of taking a few classes with her, and I'm really thrilled that she can join us today and share her knowledge. Thank you so much. My name is Maggie Summers. I'm the Program and Outreach Manager here at Maine Conservation Voters and Maine Conservation Alliance. Our organizations represent more than 13,000 members and supporters dedicated to building a just, thriving future for all by acting on the climate crisis, protecting the environment, and safeguarding our democracy. MCA does that by bringing people and organizations together to educate, inspire, and advocate, and MCV by advocating for equitable policies, holding elected officials accountable, and winning elections. Since 2020, this weekly online Lunch and Learn series has helped us advance all of those goals, creating a shared space to explore our environmental and social history, policy priorities, climate action movement, and more. And for a few notes before we dive into today's program, we will hear from Bridie first and tackle your questions in the Q&A session at the end. You don't have to wait though. Please send your questions to me or Rainey Schaefer through the chat as they occur to you. We'll synthesize them and ask as many of them as possible following the presentation. And we ask that you please not message Dr. McGreevy directly so that she can keep her focus on the presentation. If you have any technical difficulties, please message Rainey through the chat and she will help you out. And this event is being recorded and the video will be posted on our YouTube channel later this afternoon. You can also find plenty of recordings of all of our other programs on YouTube, where a number of playlists can help you focus in on particular topics. So thank you so much to all of you, and Bridie, I will turn it over to you.
Much, Maggie, for that introduction. I'll just pull up my slides and we'll get started. Great. Well, it's wonderful to be here. And, thank you again, Maggie, for the invitation and that introduction. As Maggie mentioned, my name is Bridie McGreevy, and I'm an associate professor of environmental communication in the Department of Communication and Journalism at the University of Maine. In the interest of time, I'm not going to say much about my background in environmental communication because I really think that the sense of my background, including the questions that I address and the topics that I focus on, as well as the community-based approaches that I take in all of my work, will really come through in the talk itself. So hopefully you get a feeling for how I study environmental communication. This is the overview for the talk. I'll start with an opening story about how I became involved in the clam fishery, and then as part of this story, share some additional context and connect with Maine's Municipal Shellfish Conservation Program. The remainder of this talk focuses on an article that we published in the Maine Policy Review as part of a special issue on our shared ocean. And Maggie has a bunch of links that she's going to share at the end of the talk. I think she also embedded the link in the abstract that went out and advertising this talk. So feel free to check out that article if you want to learn more about this. There are two main parts to the article itself. In the first, we focus on the crisis narratives that really dominate news media about the clam fishery. And we draw on environmental communication and Native American and Indigenous critiques of crisis narratives. So I'll talk about that. And then we really work to amplify stories of care in clamming communities that we noticed and learned through long-term partnerships within clamming communities. At the end, I will share some implications for environmental communication, really emphasizing some of what we can learn from this talk about collaborative policy development and how to shift these kinds of crisis narratives towards practices of care. I Became involved in the clam fishery in 2011 when I was a doctoral student in communication at UMaine at the time. I became involved in a group called the Frenchman Bay Partners that was very active in the Frenchman Bay area. And by becoming involved in the Frenchman Bay Partners, I met Joe Parada and the late Jim Norris, both of whom were leaders of the Frenchman Bay Regional Shellfish Committee, which is this really unique multi-town cooperative within Maine's Municipal Shellfish Conservation Program, where Joe and Jim were both founding members of what they call the Seven Towns Program, because it involves seven towns. And so that's what I'll refer to it as the Seven Towns Program as well. And they were also founding members of the partners. The partners organized around a conservation action planning process, and where Joe and Jim really wanted to make sure that this conservation action plan emphasized the unique concerns and needs related to intertidal restoration and conservation. So, as part of this effort, the partners had been inviting the 70 or so clammers who were involved in the Seven Towns program to their meetings, which were often held in Bar Harbor on the other side of the bay. And for that and a variety of other reasons, it was difficult for clammers to be able to attend those meetings. So instead, in my role as an engaged researcher and a doctoral student, I started showing up and was invited to participate in the shellfish meetings, which were held at the time in a small town hall in Lemoyne. And as I started showing up to these meetings, even though I grew up in Maine and, had long eaten steamers, camped on the coast, I had never experienced clamming, never dug clams or done anything like that. And I found myself stepping into a world that I just didn't even know existed. In addition to being really interested in the way in which the clammers were working together, collaborating, making shared decisions, engaging in stewardship activities, I also became very interested in the ecological influences and how tides were shaping their lives in really profound ways. So those early connections led to more than a decade of collaborative efforts and a number of different projects. And I had an early formative experience that you can see featured here at a place called Meadow Point in April 2013. What I'd like to do is share a couple of stories out of this early experience in fieldwork to give a sense of some of these connections within the clam fishery. So this first story is on the left, and it's about phosphorescence, tides, and collaboration. In this story, I was in a boat with a clammer who I'll call Tim, and we were paddling from Meadow Point through Raccoon Cove, across the cove to Marble Beach. And we were taking clams that we had dug from Meadow Point, and we were going to be reseeding them on Marlborough Beach. And as we were paddling along, Tim was telling me about his life as a clammer and what it was like. And at one point, right in the middle of the cove, the tide was coming in, he paused and he told me about another time that he was out in Raccoon Cove. It was nighttime and he was digging double tides, which is when clammers dig both low tides in any 24-hour period. And they do this when the weather conditions allow. That most clammers don't dig double tides this time of year because it's just so cold, but they do in the summer. And when the market conditions are conducive for that kind of double digging. So Tim was digging double tides. He was out at night. And as he was paddling through Raccoon Cove, every time he dipped his paddle into the water, the ocean just exploded with this phosphorescent plankton. And he said that's what he loved the most about being a clammer. And for me, studying communication as a graduate student, up until that point, I'd really been focusing on more of the traditional ways of conceptualizing communication of, how do we make shared decisions? How can we package information effectively and make it accessible? How do we negotiate and make meaning? And that story about phosphorescence, as well as many others I started to hear, really made me interested in the tidal and earthly influences, those ecological influences on communication and on our capacities for clamming and many other forms of collaboration. The second story is pictured here on the right, and this is connected with the context for what we were doing that day and the broader context for what clammers call doing conservation time. So we were doing conservation time at Meadow Point when we were digging these smaller, undersized clams, smaller than 2 inches in length, and bringing them across the cove to then replant them. And this is because the clams at Marble Beach had been really depleted. And this is just one of many different examples that clammers organize for doing conservation time. And when I get to the practices of care, I'll talk more about these diverse activities that are happening in these communities all across the coast to try and restore intertidal flats and sustain this livelihood. As further context, there are about 74 municipal shellfish management programs across the state, and many of them organize these kinds of activities. So for me, this was an early encounter with the kinds of practices of care that are really important for the sustainability of this way of life. This early involvement at Meadow Point and related experiences fed into a history of collaboration where we increasingly focused on topics of water pollution, intertidal restoration and restoration, and coastal access. And the connection with these kinds of topics was also connected with co-created questions that we addressed together over many years and in some ways actually continue to work on these kinds of issues today. And in that span of time, we were able to make many kinds of differences, including success in changing the pollution status of more than 1,000 acres of mud flats. This is a really pressing issue for coastal communities in general and for clamming communities in particular. There are thousands and thousands of acres that they can't dig because of the presence of pollution. Through a project that we called the 610 project, we were able to open about 80% of the flats that had a pollution designation by doing all kinds of different mitigation efforts. We worked on projects to strengthen learning within shellfish co-management because increasingly as we were, working with these towns on doing conservation time and different types of intertidal restoration practices, we're hearing from them, they're running into similar challenges, but didn't necessarily have ways of connecting and learning from each other and reproducing the wheel, reinventing the wheel essentially in dealing with some of these problems. So we did things like uh, provide engaged digital media at the Shellfish Focus Day at the Fishermen's Forum, which is actually happening next week and is going to be part of our call to action if you want to learn more about this context. We got involved in supporting community-led grants, both collaboratively writing grants, as well as working with a fund of the Maine Community Foundation over the course of 4 years to create a project called the Maine Shellfish Restoration and Resilience Fund that supported more than 40 community-led shellfish restoration projects and provided several $100,000 in grant funding that the DMR then actually, once that funding source went away, because of the success of our initial efforts, DMR started to offer community-led grants as well. As part of this, you can probably hear I'm using the word we. I will acknowledge some of the people who are included in that we, but all of this work was happening within increasingly collaborative networks. Starting in the 7 towns, I stepped into an already existing collaboration, and then these collaborations really, in many ways, a life of their own. And as part of this, we found ourselves nurturing an ethics of listening across difference. And that's one of the concluding messages that we have in this paper in the Maine policy review. And it's also an important focus for a book that I'm currently working on where I call this ethics a tidal ethics. And the title of the book is Mud and Tides, A Poetics of Collaboration. I already mentioned to Maggie that if there's interest from within this audience, I would love to come back and talk more about the book when it's at a slightly later stage. What I'd like to focus on here is really that paper that I mentioned in one aspect of this work. Um, you know, early on and throughout the history of working within these communities, I regularly encountered biased narratives against the clam fishery. And you can see these biases in the phrases that I have called out here. The sense that this is a fishery of last resort, that people only go clamming when they, or worming, another intertidal fishery, when they don't have other options. That clamming is an example of fishing down the food chain, that we no longer have cod, the ground fish, and situations with the lobster are maybe uncertain. And so clamming is what we have left. Or the idea that intertidal livelihoods are the bottom of the barrel in terms of fisheries. And those may seem a little bit hyperbolic, but recently I actually had an experience at a prominent fishing museum in Maine where this kind of bias was literally inscribed on the only, in this entire museum, a very small display on clamming, way in the back of the museum, had a bias narrative that I'm not going to repeat here because I don't want it to continue to circulate. But these are very real and they're largely vernacular, but then they are also inscribed in many different ways. And we find that they contradict the many values that we hear, as we're working with clamming communities about, beyond the economic values, which are very important, the social and historic and cultural values that, like, we hear stories from clammers about how important clamming has been in their families as a source of food, but just also as a source of meaning and intergenerational connection. This is a really important option, especially as other fisheries become increasingly limited and it's very expensive, for example, to get into lobstering. It's not expensive to get a hod and a hoe and a pair of boots and go clamming. And whether that's for your livelihood or it's for dinner, that's a really important source of sustainability in these communities. In addition to these kinds of stories, we've been learning from those like Bonnie Newsome, who's a Penobscot scholar and has been working with Alice Kelly on documenting shell heaps and thinking about shell heaps. And I have one pictured here, one of the largest ones at the whaleback shell midden in Damariscotta, thinking about shell heaps as testimony to Wabanaki people's long-term reliance on shellfish, continued reliance on shellfish, and how the presence of these shell heaps tell a very different kind of story about the sustainability, that this is a first fishery. It's not the last resort. It's the first resort. It's what we go to and have always been relying on in these intertidal gathering places. And that it also is testament to the sustainability of this fishery, that we continue to rely on clamming, and in this case, oyster fishing as well. If you were to open up a newspaper to learn about clamming, those stories of sustainability are not what you're going to read. And the picture here on the right is representative of the dominant narrative about the clam fishery in news media, emphasizing how this fishery is a lost cause. So it's another kind of manifestation of the biased narratives, and one that we increasingly encountered and we're grappling to make sense of. So when I say we, I mean many of these folks here, as well as many others who have been involved in this work, but these are all of the co-authors who helped with the main policy review paper, and where we independently and together had been involved in municipal shellfish management programs up and down the coast. And we were, you know, just talking with each other about the disconnect between what we were reading in the paper and what we ourselves were experiencing on the ground in partnership with these communities. And we've been talking about this for many years. So when we sat down to actually do the news media analysis and write the paper, it was one of these writing experiences where the paper just kind of wrote itself. And it also felt kind of cathartic. It was like, we wanted to better understand this pattern. And it really was an enjoyable writing experience. I'm very grateful for everyone shown here who contributed to it. I wanted to share just a couple screenshots of the paper itself, and then the special issue, which is actually the largest special issue that the Maine Policy Review has ever published. The Maine Policy Review is an excellent journal for a number of different reasons. One is that it's open access and it's free, so you can read all of these articles always. It also goes to every Maine library and is sent to every Maine legislator. So it's really a great source of information for those on in the audience who may be interested in writing and publishing. It's a great outlet as well. And I wanted to make a plug for a special issue that they're currently circulating a call for, focused on rural Maine. 250-word abstract is due in March, and I'd be happy to forward the link along. But you can also get more information by emailing that email address there. In the article, we started to pay attention to those types of articles that I just featured, and we took a more systematic approach, doing a media discourse analysis on 134 news articles, focusing on the framing and the words that were used in the headlines and in the text itself. We examined the word frequency as well as the valence, and we showed in this depiction a positive valence in green, neutral is in gray, and negative is in red. And then we compared the patterns with aquaculture and lobster. Here I'm showing the comparison with aquaculture. In the paper itself, we also get into an analysis of biases in the geographic coverage as well as in the sources. But I'm really just going to focus on this graphic here because I think it paints a pretty clear picture about the difference between the kind of fatalistic language that is used for clamming. On the left, you can see in short, there's a lot more red than there is green, with words like red tide, which is a harmful algae bloom, the emphasis on closures, close, different manifestations of closures, that it's toxic, declines. So just a much more negative picture about the many types of impacts related to water quality, climate change impacts, invasive species, where in contrast on the right, aquaculture is pictured, it's described as the solution. It's the wave of the future. This is what we need to grow, an industry we need to grow. It's going to help us. It's the answer to these problems. And so, these and related patterns made it clear that, the what we had noticed in single articles was really a much bigger pattern and problem, especially for how people really learn about something like a clam fishery from news media. It can help set policy agendas. And there's a real disconnect between what's actually happening on the ground and what is being covered in the press. We use that analysis to then work into a critique of the crisis narrative. And here we're drawing on, the critiques that we hear from within clamming communities themselves, as well as within academic scholarship. And I want to emphasize from the outset that, and we say this in the paper as well, that the problem with crisis and with this coverage of the clam fishery is not that it's wrong. The issue is that the crisis framing both reveals some aspects of what's happening, and at the same time, it conceals. This becomes a problem when the crisis narrative is all we hear, when it's the dominant discourse, because then we don't actually learn about the total complexity of what's happening in any given place. So to ground this critique, we draw from environmental communication and Native American and Indigenous studies that have been really working on understanding these kinds of implications of the dominance of crisis narratives. We draw extensively from a paper that Kyle White wrote called Against Crisis Epistemologies. We also draw from work by Phaedra Pizzullo, who is the current editor of the journal Environmental Communication. Environmental communication as a discipline has understood itself as a crisis discipline since its formalization in 2007. And Phaedra has been really trying to shift this conversation to approach environmental communication both as a crisis discipline and also one that centers care. I wanted to make a plug for a special issue on care in environmental communication. This is one of the links that Maggie's going to share at the end as well. If you're interested in reading more about this conversation within that field, I also have an article in that special issue, and it's related to some of the things I'm talking about in the main policy review paper. I want to highlight two issues with the crisis framing, which are interconnected. The first is that crisis framing reduces the complexity of socio-environmental change. And what I was just saying about how it conceals, it really ignores or misses important details about what's happening. And at the same time, it also reinforces a linear and urgent sense of time and a rush to technical and often ill-fitting solutions to complex justice-related issues. The graph that you see here is one that circulates regularly in the clam fishery. It shows a decline in clam landings, which is the total weight or volume of clams brought to market and sold every year. I'm going to show another iteration of this on the next slide, but this is an important object that helps communicate the urgency and the unprecedentedness of these kinds of changes within the clam fishery. And those are two words that Kyle White really focuses on in that paper in his critique of the crisis narrative. And I'll come back to why, what he says about that in just a moment. Here's a good example of how this plays out in a recent article that was published in the Maine Monitor. You can clearly see the emphasis on the crisis narrative in the title, that the clam fishery is facing a climate-driven collapse. The main cause is how warming waters are driving an increase in green crab numbers. Green crabs are an invasive species that do decimate clam populations and are really altering intertidal ecosystems. In response to this crisis, there are usually three main solutions that are put forward to trap green crabs: use netting to prevent green crabs from eating clams, and ultimately to transition to aquaculture. This is an urgent thing that we need to do because, as the graph on the left here shows, there's been a decline in clam landings. So this graph, I appreciate it in contrast to the one that I just shared because this does show community level changes in landings. So you have Waldoboro, Freeport, Deer Isle, and some of the more prominent towns within the co-management system. The graph is arranged, I think, to indicate an overall decline. But when you look at it more closely, you can see that there's actually a fair amount of variability in the landings in any place in any year. And in some towns, landings are actually going up in recent years. And I've circled two here, Brunswick and Lubec. And these two towns happen to have very active conservation programs, and they do many different types of conservation time events. That's not to draw a cause and effect relationship, but the picture on the ground is more complex than these articles make it seem. The other issue with this is that clam landings are being used as a proxy for what's actually in the mud, and it's imperfect because it's not the same measure. And there are many things that can affect overall clam landings. So in addition to declines in clam landings, there's been a decline in state license sales. This is partly related to the fact that there's limited entry, which means it can be really difficult to get a clam license because of the municipal shellfish management program that limits the number of licenses that they sell in any town. There are significant price fluctuations for clams. Right now, usually this time of year, the price per pound is about $1.20, which is not a lot at all. And overnight, especially in the summertime, you can go from $3.50 a pound to $2 a pound, and with no apparent cause. And so it's difficult. There's a lot of economic uncertainty, and it can make it difficult for families to rely on it, certainly as a sole source of income. Over time, there's been a reduction in the total number of shellfish dealers where clammers can actually sell clams, and this consolidates shellfish dealer power to the extent where shellfish dealers can decide whether or not they want to buy clams from clammers. There are complex interactions amongst fisheries related to wealth disparities, especially between clamming and lobster harvesting, that pushes clammers into lobster fishing if they can buy a boat and get access. And there's need for more research to understand these kinds of interactions. Finally, there are pressing issues related to equity and physical well-being. And for this, I wanted to make a plug for another paper in Our Shared Ocean by Tora Johnson and Kate Darling. I'm also involved in that paper where we share some related research about the health impacts of clamming and the ways in which clammers cope with some of those health impacts. Um, so clam landings are often used as an explanation for what's going on, but as this hopefully demonstrates, it's a much more complex picture on the ground. In addition to this, um, the emphasis on technical solutions can reinforce colonial structures of power. And here I want to emphasize two related frames that you often see pairing with the crisis narrative and the subsequent search for technical solutions. And these include urgency and unprecedentedness. With these crisis narratives, there's often a sense that we need to respond urgently. And when we're in an urgent temporality, there's often a sense that there's no time for the slow and deliberate work of justice. This then reinforces the search for the technical solutions, the things that we can do that will move the dial, right? That will allow us to adapt as quickly as possible, that are the quote unquote low hanging fruit. Um, Related to this, in thinking about the unprecedentedness of crises, this enacts a colonial memory that forgets the devastation of genocide and trauma. And this latter argument really draws from scholars like Kyle White, as well as Kim Tallbear and Sherry Mitchell, who push back on the sense that the unprecedented changes that we're seeing with climate change are unprecedented. That really climate change is a more modern manifestation of centuries of extractive and dispossessive land relations that are only now just affecting all of us, still differentially, still not evenly at all. But where a good friend and colleague of mine refers to climate change as a colonial monster that is rearing its head. And so that the sense that these are unprecedented pieces, these longer term histories. In the paper, we share two examples that really recharacterize the community resistance to technical solutions in terms of these types of histories and remembering the coloniality of technical solutions in the context of crisis. And the first draws from Corey, it's an extended quote from Corey Hinton, who's a Passamaquoddy lawyer. He's referring to a project that was proposed for offshore wind energy development and how that is related to a history of a failed project to develop hydropower. I'll read this in full because I think it's a narrative that we want to amplify. He says, and that exact two-lane highway, which is etched into our intergenerational trauma, is being proposed as a highway to deliver supplies to launch offshore wind from down East Maine, which means that the trauma that's already been inflicted upon our people is being proposed to be dredged back up as part of this current presidential administration's plans for renewable energy. That's in reference to the Biden administration. We've been through that. We've seen these plans dramatically impact us, and we've seen these plans fail in the past. The example on the right, connecting with community and clamming responses to and resistance of especially large-scale aquaculture, is coming out of a different history. This is not to compare the kind of dispossession and genocide that Wabanaki peoples have experienced and resisted, but to say that there is also trauma in how wild clam fisheries have been continually pushed to the margin, and where the resistance to large-scale aquaculture is coming from that place of feeling like this is yet another thing that is being imposed on their communities and that will make it even harder for them to maintain their way of life. Oftentimes, this resistance is framed as like a resistance to change and not wanting to innovate. But I think it's important to pay attention to how this is related to cultural memory and memories of trauma as well. All of this raises questions then about what it means to move away from crisis narratives and to shift from crisis to care. Um, we've been learning what it means to care from clamming communities, and just like with crisis narratives, putting that in conversation with academic scholarship about care. And here I'm drawing from a quote from Pedro Pizzullo, who I already mentioned, who emphasizes the value of care for how it helps us attend to human and non-human interconnections, interdependence, biodiversity, and system limits. This means we not only have a duty to prevent harm, but also a duty to honor the people, places, and non-human species with whom we share our world. Across these conversations and the scholarship on care, values and commitments of kinship, interconnection, and reciprocity are emphasized, as are practices of listening and witnessing power in place and working to restore relations with land and time, which are all commitments that we are trying to bring into our work. I shared a few of my favorite readings on care that I signed in my undergraduate and graduate classes. The first is Matters of Care by Maria Puig de la Bella Casa. She really gets at the alternative temporalities of care and thinks about the time of soil time and how that can help us think about care for soil and the earth. The other three are really thinking about what care means in the conditions and the violent inheritances of colonization and enslavement. So, Undrowned by Alexis Pauline Gumbs, Inciting Joy by Ross Gay, who really focuses on the violence of anti-Blackness and at the same time finds joy in his own garden, and Ordinary Notes by Christina Sharp, which does similar work of attending to the traumas of anti-Blackness, but then also shares letters and notes and love that she received from her mother. So those are just, some wonderful meditations on care. In what remains, I'd like to highlight three um, intertidal stories of care, emphasizing diverse practices of doing conservation time, the formation of partnership networks, and some success we had in collaborative policy development. The reseeding that I shared early on at Meadow Point is one among many activities that clam communities are leading all up and down the coast. And I shared some photos here for the first four, where in the Seven Towns program, you see some folks doing ecosystem and clam population surveys. This gets a community level sense of what's actually in the mud and addresses some of the limitations of using landings as a proxy for what's in the mud. Many communities use brushing, which is exactly what it sounds like, where you stick cut brush in the mud. And the idea is that as the tides wash in, the brush catches the water and creates swirls or eddies that then draw clam seed down into the mud. Tony Sutton, who's an important partner in this work, and I have been thinking about how contemporary practices like brushing have learned from Passamaquoddy and Wabanaki clam gardening techniques that also continue today, which you can see here in the bottom photo. This is a clam gardening project that is being led at Zbayak, where they are doing some intertidal restoration and using seeding and netting to grow this garden. Communities also use shoreline surveys to clean up ocean plastic and to identify sources of pollution. Gouldsboro and other communities have been doing some wonderful educational and cultural programming to grow a culture within their community that celebrates clamming as a livelihood. There's been a number of towns and then a coastwide effort to try and strengthen coastal access. And even though these communities might not describe these efforts as climate adaptation because there are diverse ideologies and perspectives about climate, climate change, we can also think about these as climate adaptation projects. There's a lot more information about these projects on a website that we created through the Maine Shellfish Learning Network called the Mudflat that you can see pictured here. We created project profiles partly to address what I was describing earlier of towns reinventing the wheel and not learning from each other. We created these project profiles to be able to share, to archive, but also to share what towns are doing and to continue that learning. Um, when I first started, or when I first became involved in the clam fishery back in 2011, to my knowledge, there were really no state level, broader regional networks that were working within the clam fishery space. But over the last 10 years or so, there's really been an incredible emergence through people getting involved in co-management. So it's, co-management functions as a partnership between the towns and DMR, as well as civic institutions and academic institutions. And this has just built broader capacity and the emergence of many different types of networks that you see listed here. We also had some support through a fund of the Maine Community Foundation, as well as other funding sources that have nurtured the emergence of these coastwide networks. And we say more about these, each of these in the paper, and we have more information about these networks on Mudflat as well. These networks were also really important for building capacity to respond to a window of opportunity that opened up to advance a collaborative policy to, as you see here, assist municipal shellfish conservation programs and address some really challenging barriers related to how, for the communities who were trying to do intertidal restoration and grow their own clams that they could then reseed their flats, they were being regulated as aquaculture and a permit process known as limited purpose aquaculture. And it was just very difficult for these towns to go through this process. And we started hearing this from places like Harpswell, which you see pictured here on the left. They had a tidal upweller and were trying to grow out these clams. And we learned from them and from Gouldsboro and some other places about what needed to change within this policy. I want to acknowledge that this was led by Senator Matty Daughtry and Dan Devereaux out of Brunswick, and where the Maine Shellfish Learning Network, and especially Gabby Hillier, who was a PhD student working with me at the time, you see her here giving testimony in front of the Marine Resources Committee. We were able to pass this legislation, which to our knowledge is the first example of successful legislation to change and support the municipal shellfish conservation program. After many, many failed attempts over the years, this has been a major issue within this fishery. And it's also, I think, a model that we can look to, because in the context of climate change, we need to, adapt our policies, our laws that no longer fit our current situation. And this provides a good example of that. So the implications in closing, I think the analysis that we do points to a real need to reframe crisis narratives in news media, and we have started on a one-on-one basis to reach out to journalists and open up conversations with them about what we've learned through this analysis, and overall the response initially has been positive. We've learned a lot about the importance of listening and showing up into communities, being invited and showing up with an orientation to listening and with an eye towards forming networked efforts towards, fostering policy change. And we've also started to think about, what we've learned out of this work in terms of broader climate adaptation efforts and, things that we see happening within the Maine Climate Council's work and their 4-year climate action plan entitled Maine Won't Wait, where you see some of that same urgency framing. And, there have been some critiques of, the way that initiative has been organized, recognizing it also is an incredible example of broad interdisciplinary collaboration and public participation. But it does, that framing alone makes us ask the question, um, you know, what becomes possible if we do wait? What becomes possible in that tidal pause where we take a moment to listen? Because listening doesn't take time. That's a colonial orientation to listening. In our experience, listening makes time and it makes different futures possible. I want to conclude by saying that remembering care in the midst of crisis becomes a way of slowing down to listen and learn from stories, histories, and practices within coastal communities to lead us all towards more just and resilient futures. So thank you for listening. Look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Professor McGreevy. That was so incredible. And we have so many questions and thank yous from the chat. People are really enjoying it. So that was so wonderful. Thank you. And we have some incredible calls to action today. They're all around engaging the power of listening and learning to really take meaningful steps to support Maine's coastal communities. So keep an eye out in your email. You will be getting all of the resources that Dr. McGreevy mentioned, as well as a few calls to action, including how you can support Wabanaki sovereignty. Um, but we have so many questions, but I'd love to start. Clamming is clearly one of Maine's most valuable fisheries, especially in terms of revenue. But as we've heard today, that's only part of the story. What are some other ways that this fishery is valuable to these communities?
Yeah, I mean, I think it gets to some of the stories that I shared and just how clamming is a way of life that has persisted here for millennia. That Wabanaki people. I mean, there are many words when if you look at the Passamaquoddy language portal and also the Penobscot language online resources, you learn that there are just many, many diverse words for these clam gathering places. One of the ones that Tony Sutton and I refer to a lot is Monaskadig clam gathering place. This was associated with the Bar Harbor area. So I think there's really so much value in diversifying our histories and narratives of clamming because it helps us understand just not only contemporary values, but how long these values have been circulating within these places and how Wabanaki languages remember these clam gathering places. Or, for example, like that in the Passamaquoddy language, there are probably more than a dozen different words for tides and tidal relations. And I'm not going to attempt to share those. But if you just type in tides in that portal, you'll see just all of the many ways in which these livelihoods have persisted. And that continues in settler clamming communities as well, that this is something that it continues to be really important for families. I've good friends who are clammers, but they involve their kids, and because they want their kids to know how to dig clams, but also because it's a great thing for families to be able to do together. It's not very expensive to get a residential clam license, and especially in the summertime to go down to the coast and dig a peck of clams for dinner. And I didn't share this story, but that's really how I got involved in this. I had an early experience harvesting mussels for dinner. And I was like, you can just do this? You can just wade out into the water and pick mussels and go back and cook them and have this incredibly nutritious and delicious meal. Um, I think there are just too few opportunities for that kind of connection. And clamming still offers that. And in that you see many values beyond just the economics of it.
Thank you so much. And I know you mentioned a lot about how it's a really collaborative partnerships with all of these shellfish co-management groups. And you mentioned the Seven Towns group that you are a part of. I'd love to hear a little bit more about what this collaboration actually looks like in practice. Is it over
Mhm.
a dinner table? Is it, hanging out at a local restaurant? Yeah.
Yes, and yes. It's all of those things. I mean, I think that's the really interesting thing about working in a context like this. Like it's different from, because I've done a lot of like collaborative work with well-defined organizations where you come together around meetings. Yes, there might be social gatherings, but it's pretty clearly bounded by the organizational membership and what you're actually focused on. And there are definitely some elements of that, like, the group of people who were um, involved in writing the main policy review paper, we collaborated on the main shellfish co-management initiative, and that involved, meeting on at least a monthly basis for many years, and then also collaborating with each other in a number of other different spaces. So it looked more traditional as a collaboration in that way. But then there are just like all of these diffuse and heterogeneous activities as well. Being out on the mudflat together is really key, regardless of the kind of collaboration or project we're involved in. We're very intentional about making sure that we spend time together on the flats for building relationships, but also for attuning to the place and learning from within that place. In the formation of the Main Shellfish Learning Network, we went to a number of different coastal forts and lighthouse sites to, learn more about that colonial history and to think differently about fisheries and to attune to the kind of memories and histories that shell heaps can communicate. So there's been a lot of that kind of work. And then there are also these spaces like the co-management, or the Municipal Shellfish Conservation Program, which is an example of co-management, is a really unique space in communities where um, a town will have a shellfish ordinance, and they, as part of the ordinance, they usually have to meet on, about a monthly basis. Um, and showing up in these spaces just allows you to get involved. And it's also a unique space in that it's, there's a lot of people have diverse backgrounds and identities and ideologies, and so it's an opportunity to work across those kinds of differences as well, which we don't have many spaces like that, at least not ones that I'm involved in. And so yeah, it's a lot of different types of interactions, and I think that's partly what's kept me involved for so many years. It's just endlessly interesting.
Thank you so much. It sounds endlessly interesting, and those sounds like it sounds like a really good model
Mhm.
to look for other collaboration efforts. I know I had quite a few questions about how we could apply that approach to either other fisheries or the environmental sphere. I didn't know if you had any thoughts about that.
Yeah. Um, One of the things that I really focus on in the book, Mud and Tides, A Poetics of Collaboration, and I learned this out of the early collaborations with the Seven Towns program and an early model of tidal ethics at the time I was calling Working the Tides, where in contrast to dominant discourses of collaboration, and by dominant, kind of the shorthand is like there's a sense that with collaboration, we need to find common ground. We all need to get on the same page. We need to work towards mutual understanding, create shared agreements. And that's not to say that there aren't moments like that in a collaboration, but in my experience in this context, and I think in as it relates to many other contexts, collaboration is really a process of staying with difference. And any common ground that you might have is temporary at best. And so I think that really pushes on our sense of ethics and the need for more relational forms of ethics where our respective responsibilities across those differences are continually part of the conversation. And how do we work together, recognizing that any agreement that we might have is, you know, partial at best. As part of this, I draw from a related theory called Poetics of Relation by a scholar named Edward Glissant. And he talks about the importance of the right to opacity. And the sense there is that, like, we can't ever know what another person is thinking, but we can kind of like weave fabrics together by staying with our differences and opacities. And I know that gets a little more philosophical, but yeah, to me, um, that orientation to collaboration, the emphasis on difference and opacity has been a much better match for the kinds of experiences I've had and for how to build capacities for staying with that trouble, as Donna Haraway says, like staying with the differences and making more difference through time.
Thank you so much. I think we have time for one more question. I'd love to ask for any other researchers or professors in the audience. I know you mentioned a lot of students that were involved in this, as well as other professors. What is the value of involving students in this kind of work?
Yeah. Um, I guess I can speak to the value that I've experienced with undergraduate students and with graduate students, which are interconnected but slightly different. Um, with these partnerships, I've experienced so much generosity from community partners who want to share their knowledge not only with me, but with the students that I'm working with. And, have had a number of field experiences where I've been able to bring undergraduate students to the coast. Many of these students were just like me, stepping into a world that they didn't know existed, and that really helped them learn about what they're learning, hearing about in communication classes, but connecting it with real world on the ground experiences. And at the same time, also building their own relationships with people that then will often or sometimes continue after the class itself. So, like the learning experience, yeah, feeds into a longer term relationship for them, which has personal meaning for them, but also can have professional benefits too. So, some really important benefits there for graduate students. I think one of the most important things, and I've heard this from every graduate student who I've worked with who has approached their research in this way, is that it just makes their research matter more to them personally because it matters to the community and the people who they're working with. It's when you get to the end of the thesis of the dissertation and you have a whole community of people who show up and want to hear what you wrote about and what you learned. I mean, that is such a powerful experience. And then to see how that knowledge lives on in these communities and similar to the experience with the undergraduate students, how those relationships live on in graduate students' lives, um, it's just incredibly meaningful. And I think as academics, um, this is part of the ethics that we have a responsibility to think about, how can we get involved in ethical and appropriate ways when we're invited to do so with an orientation to listening in these communities and to connect the students and the other kinds of resources that we have available to us. Um, because, yeah, um, this work, yeah, benefits from having access to those.
Thank you so much. And I hope some people on this call are going to tell their friends about the incredible work going on at the University of Maine and the comms department. Thank you so much. This has been an absolute joy to see you and to have you on. And I hope to see you again after the book is published. I know we would all love that.
Well, thank you so much, Maggie. It was great to reconnect with you as well, and I'd love to come back.
Of course. Thank you. And thank you to everyone watching. We'll be back in 2 weeks and we'll be joined by the Conservation Law Foundation, Maine Audubon, Maine Youth for Climate Justice, and the Natural Resources Council of Maine to talk about the latest climate science and actions that we can take here on the state level. Thank you so much. And yes, it was wonderful to see you all. Thank you.